Welcome to the Edifice Complex, the property design and development podcast. Let your hosts Adam Muggleton and Robert Bean keep you up with who is innovating and doing great work, perspective on the adjacent possible, and challenges to the status quo.
Welcome to the Edifice Complex. I'm Robert Bean, your co-host and unofficial mediator, here with my friend and colleague and official agitator. You don't have most anything to do with buildings, really. Welcome, Mr. Adam Muggleton. Say hello.
Hello there. Right. So I'm excited today. I'll tell you why. I think we have a podcast first. This is the first person who's been on the podcast who has a picture of a plane with flames around it, an airplane with flames around it on their LinkedIn profile. So expectations are high for me.
Yeah, our guest today is the philosopher's philosopher. He is an amazing gentleman, graduate of the Royal Roads Military College, which I've been out there. That's a fabulous campus. Royal Military College of Canada and the Canadian Forces School of Aerospace Technology and Engineering, where he earned his bachelor and master's degrees and served as an aerospace engineering officer in the Royal Canadian Air Force. Amongst his skill sets are explosive engineering and avionics engineering. That's always a nice combination. In between that, he earned a master's in divinity, University of Emmanuel College, and being a lifelong learner, he's been continuing his schooling through Harvard Kennedy School and Simon Fraser University. And I don't know, Matthew, welcome to the show, Matthew Oliver. That's quite the profile of education. We haven't even talked about your jobs yet. It's good to have you on.
Thanks, Robert. Thanks, Adam. It's a short attention span.
That's an excuse for it. Matthew, before and during and presently your studies, you served as repair and weapons officer, staff officer of avionics and armament, flight commander. You had like 14 test pilots under your management. Those guys are crazy. I know a test pilot in the U.S. Air Force for helicopters, not fixed wings. You were in forensics, both, I think, as a civilian and in the military, if I'm correct. And we met, I think, through our COVID activities, trying to get the Alberta School Board to pay attention to some pretty basic stuff. And that's when you were with the PEGA as the Deputy Registrar and Chief Regulatory Officer for the Association of Professional Engineers and Geophysicists of Alberta. Since then, you've moved on to the Alberta Utilities Commission. Is that right?
Yep.
I don't know anybody that we've had on our show, maybe perhaps Professor Olin Cliff from Oxford University, who has such a grasp of ethics and morals and all the things that have gone into your brain. We have an audience that wants to hear your story. So how did you get here?
Okay. You got 5 hours. So I'm a boy from a small community in Manitoba called Selkirk. It's the catfish capital of the world. I'm sure you've all heard of it.
I have, actually.
At one point, my dad was the chair of the Chamber of Commerce and my uncle was the mayor. So I said, I just need to go back and be the chief of police. We'll have the whole town stitched up. And that's Selkirk's right on the Red River, so in the Red River Valley. So the Red River figures prominently in my family, and we're Métis as well. So that's the core of the Métis homeland. Funny story, because, the Métis were sort of birthed in the Red River settlement. So when we meet another Métis person, the first question you always ask in Indigenous communities is, where's your family from? Where's the land you're connected to? And I say Red River. And they're like, yeah, we know that. We're all from Red River, but where are you actually from? No, from Red River. Literally, I grew up 2 miles from it. So I joined the military at 17. Not quite the UN definition of child soldier, but I did have to get my parents to sign the enrollment forms and went off to Rhodes for a couple of years and then RMC in Kingston to finish up, which was no small amount of culture shock. I think it took me a decade after that to kind of get my gyros realigned. It was an interesting experience. 20 years in the military, did lots of really cool stuff there. For a guy with a short attention span, it was a great job because basically, I think in 20 years, I did, what last time I counted, 23 different jobs. But I spent most of it in the operational world. So I did 6 years on fighter squadrons, 3 in the junior positions, and then 3 years as chief engineering officer. 441 and 416, the 2 squadrons, neither of which exist anymore. And I had the chance to do 4 years at the Aerospace Engineering Test Establishment doing flight tests. And even that was kind of neat because I went there as an instrumentation electromagnetic compatibility engineer right after I did grad studies in antenna design. And I got promoted after a year there. So I spent the second year working as an instrumentation engineer, but as a senior officer, which was great because I was the same rank as my boss. And then I moved over into that deputy and then flight commander position on the test side. So had this small team, 14 flight test engineers, qualified test pilots, and specialist engineers. And I have to say that was probably the funnest job I have ever had. Minimum education level was basically a master's degree or test pilot school. Really focused, really test pilots and test engineers are incredibly bright people. I always felt a step behind them, but doing flight test work, it was such interesting work. And that's where the airplane on fire is. With the last big project I did there was there's a big ethics component to this too, but there was a big issue with the ejection seats in the Tudor and the T-Bird, 2 older jet aircraft. They were killing pilots. And we were the unit that was trying to agitate to get that fixed. The Air Force initially didn't want to fix it. That's the long story. We did win in the end and got a project, not a big project. It was like $1.5 million. I mean, it wasn't much money we were arguing for, but we overhauled the ejection seats to make their aerodynamics better. And saved a bunch of lives because of that. But the picture on my LinkedIn page is one of the live test shots out of the back seat of one of those T-33 Silver Star aircraft, testing the seat with an anthropomorphic test dummy. And of course, we don't do live ejection testing anymore. Used to. Be
one of my questions is some poor bug is trapped in there.
Used to in the early days. We visited Patuxent River, the U.S. Navy Flight Test Center there, and they still have the test fixtures. They used to fire people up on a inclined set of rails to test the effects of impulse G-loading on the human spine. And they would actually put test pilots in the rig and fire them up at different accelerations.
Holy crap.
So lots of interesting. And I was an air weapons officer, so that was my explosives engineering specialty. I spent a bit of time teaching. I spent a couple of years in headquarters in Germany, closing out our bases at Lahr and Baden in there, which was super amazing. And then when I was actually in my last squadron tour in Cold Lake, I had a motor vehicle accident. It was a pretty benign one, but I ended up trashing my lower back. So I ended up being medically released because I was no longer able to deploy to a place like Afghanistan. Was still doing my job to do all the duties, but they had emphasized what they called universality of service at that point, which meant if you weren't able to deploy to a tent in the middle of the sandbox, you weren't considered fit for duties anymore. And I had just been selected for promotion and going to staff college in Toronto, which is kind of like a military executive MBA. So I kind of said, I didn't get in this job to sort of be to sit in one place. And the rule was if you didn't meet the universality of service, you went into one job, you were no longer eligible for promotion or career courses, and your commanding officer could decide on an annual basis whether they wanted to kick you out or not. So I said, which is when I went back to school, did a degree in divinity. I worked for a couple of years full-time as a priest in the Anglican Church, which led to some health issues because of stress and the problems I was having with my back. So I ended up having to leave that and fortuitously stepped into a quasi-judicial tribunal job doing workers' compensation appeals. I had some legal stuff from the military because I was a summary trial president to do as part of the military discipline process. And I was qualified in military law to be an assisting officer to help people in court martials. But I didn't really have the experience they were looking for, but the guy hiring me was an aviation buff. So when he saw my resume, he really wanted to interview me. And I guess I got through the interview, and I did that for 9 years, 3 years part-time and then 6 years full-time, hearing about injured workers and employers, which was really interesting work with an interesting social justice component too, because got to both deal with people that were abusing the system and people who had been chewed up by the system. So people that had lost their houses were living on the street because they'd had their benefits cut off when they actually had a really serious injury. Transitioned from there over to the engineering regulator, which is where you and I eventually connected, Robert, because when the pandemic started, I kind of stepped sideways into air quality advocacy, both because the stuff I was seeing on social media from some members of the medical profession was making my head explode, but also because of the role of the regulator. I thought we had some specific role to talk about air quality and engineering obligations, and then left there last year to go and do utilities regulation. So that's the story.
Wow.
That's quite the resume there. I've got so many questions, but before we get on to some of the more serious stuff like airborne pathogens, just going back to your early days. So I have a few regrets in my life, but one of the things I have a regret on is not doing some military service where I was tested, where someone takes you in and the only bottom line they have is we can't kill this idiot, but otherwise they test you. Do you feel that was the making of you going into the military?
Oh, yeah, man. I could talk about that for hours. Yeah, for sure. Although I can make a joke at this point for any Army person that's listening, who'll be laughing at an Air Force person saying they were tested. The Army guy asked the Air Force guy, what would you do if you were on deployment and there was something wrong with your tent? And the Air Force guy says, the first thing I do is call the concierge. And the Army guy said, what? Yeah, to ask him why the hell there's a tent in my hotel room.
That's right.
That's funny. Because it's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, the re-enculturation that happens when you join the military kind of involves a necessary undoing of what you were before, and then remaking it into a place that the organization can make the most use of you. So it is really this forced cultural shift through runs and marches and push-ups. Still remember my basic platoon commander in basic telling me after we'd gotten 12 inoculations, every corner of your body you could possibly get a needle jammed into. And the next day we were all so sick with fevers, and infantry soldier, Captain Beardsley, said, "Gents, the only thing that helps with sore arms from vaccinations is push-ups."
Embrace the suck and push through it, man.
Yeah. And the military college system is, who I am today is directly traceable to that. So as much as I talk about the things that I had to sort of work out afterwards, I can tell you an engineer story. So when we were looking at accreditation, the accreditation system with Engineers Canada, they have this thing called accreditation units, which is kind of the measure. It's one unit is a 15-minute lecture, I think is the way it works, but they use it to add up how much education a program gives to determine if it meets the minimum standards. And there was a paper that had been written in the 90s, I think, that talked about, they did a survey of all the electrical engineering programs across Canada and added up how many of these units each one of them had. And the range was 1,700 to 2,800, which is a pretty big range in terms of volume of education.
Yeah.
And the number they settled on was 1,850 for a sort of standard 4-year engineering program. So I'm reading this paper. I'm like, I wonder where the 2,800 program was. The Royal Military College. And after I graduated, the University of Manitoba had a deal where if you were military, you could apply to them they give you credits for military experience. So if you'd done staff school and professional development programs, they give you 3 credits of arts for that. So I was curious how far I was away from a 3-year BA. So I went and added up all the stuff I had and discovered that with all the extra courses I'd done in engineering, I was 2 6-credit courses away from a 3-year BA. because I had to do English, history,
Yeah.
French, lots and lots of French, physical education, drill, all those additional things that were added into the program. So it was a really, really busy 4 years. Time management by forest fire, really. So the interesting part was every other weekend we had a military training weekend, and we'd do a wing parade. So you'd spend all day Saturday on the parade square practicing. And then you do the parade Sunday morning, and then Saturday afternoon and Sunday afternoon, you do military training of some kind, lectures or be out in the field. And I realized when I started, after I hurt my back and started wrestling with chronic pain, that one of the coping strategies I had was that I had learned how to stand in the hot sun for 3 hours without moving. And that sort of physical discipline that we all cursed it, of course, because nobody likes standing on the parade square in scarlet tunics. But so realized later in life as I was dealing with this medical issue that, that's actually one of the reasons why we do that drill, is because it teaches you mental and physical discipline that you wouldn't get otherwise.
Yeah, the idea is to make it unconscious action for you, right?
Yeah. Now, the downside of it is, I mean, I don't think I actually learned as much technical stuff as I would have if I'd gone to Queen's or somewhere, because it's really like in second year, I think I had 10 exams in 11 days was my second year exam routine at Christmas. Right. So it's really, it's literally like study until 3 a.m., sleep for 3 hours, get up, write the exam, take a nap, get up and study again, and do that for 11 days. So it's hard to get into the mode of retaining knowledge then. So for example, like transistors, right, which is pretty important electrical engineering stuff. I didn't actually figure out how transistors worked until maybe 3 or 4 years after I graduated, and then actually went back and read the stuff and said, oh, that's big work. It's so simple. I don't know why I missed it at the time.
Yeah. So you said I heard the word Rhodes. Now I know what a Rhodes Scholar is. Are you actually a Rhodes Scholar, or is that a...
No, Rhodes, Royal Roads, ROADS, not with an H.
Right. Okay. Cool. No problem. All right.
Yeah, we refer to Rhodes as roads, and the people who went to Rhodes as rodents. And RMC is RMC, but the people who go to RMC for 4 years are called purebreds in the lingua franca. And we used to jokingly refer to ourselves who did 2 years at Rhodes and then 2 years at RMC, because we were really neither part of neither community. We used to call ourselves inbreds because we did both.
There's always a group and an in-group and an out-group, right?
That's right.
That's funny. So one other question before we get on to some more serious stuff. Divinity. What was that about? Of all the degrees I think I might study, divinity, I don't think will pop into my head.
Yeah. So there was a clear vocational call that was going on as I was getting ready to leave the military. It didn't. I remember early on in my career, somebody telling me that you needed to put together like 5 and 10 year career plans to figure out where you're going to be. And I think my wife and I did it once, and then I realized that nothing ever worked out that way anyway. So I stopped wasting time on it and just figured out where I was supposed to go next. So it seemed like the right place to go after the military. And I kind of assumed that I was going to be working in parish ministry for the rest of my working days. That didn't work out, but it turned out even better than I thought it would, because I ended up doing this quasi-judicial stuff, which actually set the path for sort of the second half of my career, which was doing regulatory work and then doing utility regulation now. When I interviewed with a forensic firm, because they were looking for a contract electrical guy, the interview finished, I think he decided to hire me. And then as I was walking out of his office, he said, "What divinity? What's that all about?" And I said, we're a very secular profession, right? So I counted that lots, but I just said, actually, when I reflect on it, reading theology made me a better engineer, and being an engineer made me a better theologian, because there's so many common touch points between engineering, theology, and actually law as well. I found where the use of language, they're just different approaches to how language is used. And we focus on that lots in engineering, right? With standards, codes and standards, construction plans, project management plans, all the stuff we do, it's all based on technical reports, all based on the use of language to describe complex stuff.
Absolutely. You're talking about moral code, ethics, integrity, all these things, they do overlap. It's a Venn diagram, right? Sound like Kamala Harris. It's a Venn diagram. So
So the best way I understand, Matthew, after reading and listening to you for the time that we worked on the COVID stuff, was you could take 100 people and have them unroll a 100-foot electrical cord, and then 99 of them can't actually roll it up back the way it should be rolled. Matthew, you just drop the cord on the ground and it's already perfectly put away. Your ability to enter a dialogue, understand what is actually being said and not being said, and then putting the pieces together so that everybody can understand it with a solid argument is rare. And you've done that many, many times in the times that I've sort of observed you in action.
Well, that's a trait of an officer, right?
Thanks for that, Robert. I spend most of my life thinking I'm an idiot, so it's always nice to hear my observation. I was we were doing ejection seat testing, and I was standing in front of my whiteboard one day when I was doing flight test, and I was trying to figure out, we had a jet engine test cell on the base for J85, an older jet engine that's used on the T-38. See if we could use a jet engine to do wind blast testing, like could we get 500 knots of jet exhaust. So I was just trying to work out sort of first order, what would the temperature of the flow be at sufficient velocity. So I had this drawn up with a Venturi, and I was trying to figure this out. And one of our test pilots wandered by, an American exchange guy, whose call sign was Sulu, super guy. And he's standing behind me, and he makes a comment about the diagram. And I turned to him, and I heard his comment as, "I don't think you know what you're doing. It's an issue with me, right? Not him." But that's the way I heard it. Yeah. And I said, "Oh yeah, I know that. I'm not an idiot." And he said, "Okay." And he turned and walked away. So 2 years later, we're at my farewell. And at military farewells, people get up and tell funny stories about you. And Sulu gets up and he says, "Let me tell you the story of the day he was doing this Venturi on his whiteboard." And he said, "I'm not an idiot." And at that point I said, "Okay, I don't have anything to contribute here," because I had no idea what he was doing. I had no concept of what he was doing. And I was just shocked, because I thought, okay, you're a test pilot. He's got a master's degree in aerodynamics from UTSI, Tennessee State. Really, really brilliant test pilot and a super nice guy. And I'd assumed at the time that he was being critical of what I was doing, not that I was doing something that he couldn't get his head around, because I thought what I was doing was really basic and simple. So yeah, just the story of how many times I don't appreciate sometimes my ability to synthesize, because I always assume that I'm an idiot.
That's a good story, because you can change your life and your outlook on life just by assuming the best and not the worst of what's happening around you, right?
Yes.
You assumed it was an attack. He wasn't even on that wavelength with you. And you sort of missed each other, right? It's such a good story about, if someone comes at you, you think, "Oh, that don't seem right." But you can always assume, maybe it was wasn't malintent, right? You can be the first one to give the benefit of the doubt, can actually change a lot in your relationships, I think.
I agree fully. And for, an aerospace engineer in the fighter world, I think we always, as engineers, are wrestling with the idea of being second string players to the fighter pilots, who are very often larger than life.
That are glory boys, right?
Yeah. And very, very, especially in the test pilot world, very, very incredibly skilled people. But I was reacting a bit out of that. Here's a test pilot. And I'm hearing that as a criticism, not as a.
It was insecurity, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So look, I've seen one thinking of. We're going to have a conversation about how you guys got together during the COVID thing and how you sort of try to speak to the school board. But hearing your story now in more detail, it really makes sense. Like the engineering background, the divinity. Now people go, divinity, yeah, but we're talking about core values. Ethics, these all play into it. As you say, it touched on law, touched on engineering. These things all come together. So it's sort of almost like a complete convergence of your skill set and background come into play at this point, right? So let's tell us a quick story about how you guys got together and the mission you were on. I suppose Robert might be the best one to start with that. So I didn't direct that question. That's my bad, isn't it?
Well, there was a number of us that were like observing the insanity. Here we are, we're faced with all of this evidence that this is a pathogen that was in the air. And, at the time it was kids don't transmit. It's not going to happen in schools. Pathogens just aren't that smart. Like, they don't know the difference between an 80-year-old and an 8-month-old, right? and at the same time, they were talking about, 3-meter distances and 15 minutes. And I'm thinking to myself, like, pathogens don't carry GPS. They don't know time. They don't know distance. They don't know age. All we know, it's in the air, and you can look around you and Mother Nature tells you how particles get distributed. You don't need to have a degree in whatever. You just watch Mother Nature and she'll tell you how things move around the space. So there was a group of us who just couldn't believe what we were seeing that was coming out. And Matthew, I think it was in Twitter, you showed up and started participating. And I personally didn't realize at first that you were with Apega. I just was reading some of your stuff and
hang on a sec there, mate. So just for our international listeners, Apega is the engineering licensing board and authority in Alberta, Canada. So it's responsible for licensing professional engineers. Sorry about that, Karen.
Yeah. So we were working to try to educate not only the school board, but people in general, medical professionals, engineers too, as well. There was no profession that we weren't interested in trying to educate them on, at least share what we knew about physics and chemistry. Which everybody seemed to went to the same schools. How they don't understand that we did. It's so bizarre. But anyways, long story short, ASHRAE, the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, Air Conditioning Engineers, Bill Bonfleth was the chair of the task force that later went on to write the new standard, which is 241. But their group of individuals wrote protocols and, tried to use ASHRAE and ASHRAE members as a means of elevating the knowledge about what we need to do with particles and spaces and the buildings it occupied. And so we had in Alberta, Matthew, I think I first contacted you to actually chair, or you were the guest. I don't remember.
Introducer.
You introduced Bill. And I remember your introduction, and you mentioned ethics, ethics in engineering and ethics in society, about our responsibilities to do the right thing with the knowledge that we have. And part of, for those that are listening, the students that are listening to this podcast, when you get out and you start to practice as an engineer, you can't ignore your ethics. You have an obligation to society. And here we were in a mix of professionals from the medical world that also had an ethical obligation, and they were, to their best of their knowledge, trying to fulfill theirs. As engineers, we were trying to fulfill our obligations, and oftentimes there was conflict. And the school boards, I don't even know. I don't even think they have an ethical obligation as teachers. Do they? I don't even know if they do. I mean, engineers do, lawyers do, physicians do. Just do educators?
Teachers do, but the facilities people, like the support staff and administrators, I think, fall under different regimes. So there is no professional body for facilities people except for the engineering regulator, and the administrators I don't think are licensed by ATA the same way the teachers are. So the teachers have a clear ethical code of behavior.
Actually, just to expand on that a little bit, let's think about this, right? So engineers, teachers, medical professionals, it's like a Hippocratic oath if you're a medical person, right? Do no harm. But there's also a regulatory board, right? Your engineering license, your medical license, your teaching qualification, it's always at stake based on your performance, right? Now, you've got to do something pretty heinous to get rid of it. But ethics is rolled in that. But if you're a school board, you're not under that level of, what's the word? Professional duty of care, right? So yes. I think that was one of the disconnects here, right? You have a school board, which is a pretty powerful political entity in itself. Then you've got teachers, engineers, medical people, political people, all fighting it out with their point of view, right? Which I think is one of the reasons this whole thing went a bit off the rails. Would you agree with that?
I do, yeah. And we were just chatting about this yesterday on Twitter. We're also in this era, right? What was Oxford's word of the year? Was it 2020 post-truth or 2021?
That's it. Yeah, I remember that 2020. I think it was. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've got this cultural milieu that's in this phase known as postmodernity, and I'm not an expert in postmodernity, but one of the things postmodernity brings is a reaction to modernity, which is considered to be the scientific rationalist framing, where we look to facts and scientific evidence. So postmodernity reacts to that and says basically that all truth is suspect, because truth is ultimately just shaped in the way that people who have power want to control others. And, there's certainly, like, when I hear that, I think, well, yeah, I can point to places where, spin doctor, right? Putting a spin on something is exactly what postmodernity is talking about. That's
yes.
We're going to talk about COVID being mild because that's the message we need to spin. Whether it's based in reality or not is another thing. But when I used to do regular ethics lectures for engineering students. And one of the things I always laughed at is I had a couple slides about postmodernity because I thought you need to know this because you don't hear it in the program, that you're going out into a world that is actually fundamentally irrational in many ways. This you do you. I've done my own risk assessment, even though I know nothing about risk assessments. Every time I would talk about postmodernity in sharing classes, I would see all the students doing this. Here's the alt text, shaking their heads and looking confused and perplexed. And I realized that people in technical professions were vaccinated against postmodernity because it's ludicrous, right? Like,
yeah, when you're trained in science and engineering, postmodernity is BS, right?
Yeah, especially in our field of practice. Like, what you're going to tell me that the like factors of safety are my truth, not your truth? You're going to do something different, like
tell that to jumping out of the airplane.
Yeah, exactly. So the part of it, at least, and it'd be interesting to read what the sociologists write about this over the next decade, because this is it's really societal behavior stuff that I don't know that much about, but it's one of the things that's created this complete weirdness that we're in right now is this influence of postmodernity, which most people don't even realize. They'll say, I've done my own risk assessment. What they really mean is I've decided I feel comfortable with this. I have no idea what the actual risks are, but I feel comfortable eating indoors at a restaurant that's packed full of people, or going to a bar at night with my friends. And I feel comfortable with that, is what they really mean when they say I've done my own risk assessment. Whereas somebody that's actually done a risk assessment as we would understand it, even a qualitative one, which is supposed to be dispassionate and heartless and pull out all the risks and analyze them 6 ways and figure out if you can mitigate them and then what residual risk do you have left, that's not what people talk about. But because we're in this postmodern era, people will say that. And then when you challenge them, they'll say, well, why are you challenging me? I've done my own risk assessment. Like, I've satisfied myself. You have no business telling me whether I'm right or wrong.
Now, this is interesting because this whole issue also sort of goes into like personal sovereignty and autonomy, and that overlap with government requirements sometimes to be authoritarian, right? So this postmodernity thing, when you hear people say, oh, the science is settled or we own the science, that's another sort of manifestation of that then. Would you agree?
Yeah. Actually, I think I haven't thought about that before, but I think you're right, because what they're actually saying is that we have chosen to believe the science is settled.
Yeah.
And that's our truth. And I remember my daughter's a chemist, and I remember when she was in school, we would have huge debates about climate change. Good-natured debates, just testing the evidence and challenging each other on our thoughts. And I remember more than once saying, somebody would say the science is settled on it. And I'd be like, well, then it's not science, is it? Right?
For saying that, saying science is settled, it drives me insane.
Yeah. It's like saying the science of concrete is settled. Like, we settled that in 1822, and it's never changed since. Like, it's ludicrous to say.
You know what it is? That's the same as saying history is over. The Berlin Wall's down. History is over.
Yeah.
Bullshit, right?
Yeah.
My friends there, everybody. Anyway, yeah, I'm so glad to hear you say that, because when I hear like, we own the science, I own the science is settled, I'm thinking, no. But unless you've got an engineering or science background, it doesn't sound ludicrous, I guess.
No, especially if you've bought into that, into the whole postmodern thing. Although I will say that one of the great things that's come out of the pandemic for me is intersecting with a whole bunch of people like the two of you. The area advocacy group in Calgary, an amazing group of people, some of whom are better than some of the engineers I've worked with on technical stuff. I won't name any names, but I'm thinking of one person in particular who's got a fine arts background, who is, amazing on the technical side. And I have actually no problem considering her like part of my engineering college of people who bring technical expertise, because it comes down to critical thinking and your ability to process information and learn. And if you're willing to do that, then you can.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is, the message for students is, the other thing I always say to engineering students is, your role as an engineer is to be the interpreter of a complex reality. So many times in accident commissions and inquiries and investigation reports I've read, there has been somebody or some organization that has had the ability to intervene and break the chain of causation. But almost invariably, it's because somebody has decided they can't speak up or somebody has overruled them. And, one of the things as technical professionals, because of our public welfare obligations, is that we always have that obligation to speak up. It's the reason I started opening my mouth up about air stuff in 2020, because I could see the failure modes starting to develop in public health and infectious disease rhetoric that were the same sort of failure modes that, brought Challenger down. The exact same sort of stuff going on, which is why I stepped into an area which I don't practice in at all, to say, there's cognitive issues with what is being discussed here. This is not correct.
So
then the plexiglass barriers, right? Sorry, I'll just finish with that. Which, when I saw those plexiglass barriers being recommended by public health, I had to peel myself off the ceiling, because I'm like, anybody who's done a first year fluids course or basic fluids course knows what happens to flow when it goes over the top of the solid barrier and you get a back eddy. I'm like, my gracious, so you're gonna diss respirators because you don't have randomized controlled trials to prove they work, but you're gonna stick plexiglass barriers everywhere with no evidence whatsoever. Holy crap!
So that was straight up pandering to populism, right? So God, there's so many ways to go with this. But what's interesting to me is, so you inject yourself into this, right? Because it's starting to drive you crazy, and you're probably not alone in that. And several people are in that situation, but once you injected yourself in, because, at some point the stupidity starts to hurt your brain, right? How much pushback did you get? Did you get pushback from friends or colleagues? Did you find it was worse than you thought when you went in, sort of started going deeper into this rabbit hole?
It's interesting. Some people, I commented on a evolutionary biologist post, who's out in Ontario, the other day. And it's actually the first time in 3 years I've gotten any sort of trolling on something I've said.
That's when you know you're on target, mate, when they fire back at you.
So I very, very little pushback. I mean, there was maybe a little at work about, because regulators are always dealing with the challenge of not being politically active, trying to be independent, but trying to protect the public at the same time. So there's a little bit of pushback at work about being out there. But it's one of the reasons why my Twitter account is personal and not associated with my work persona at all, because it's I keep those separate. So no, it was surprisingly little pushback. Except of course from the people that I was critiquing. And I take great pride in one of the ID docs in Alberta put a post up that I think was specifically about me, that said, I wish engineers would stop trying to tell us what to do in terms of PPE with outbreaks in hospitals.
That was one of the best. I'm glad I had ringside seats for that exchange, because for our listeners, Matthew in his career, PPE was, you had to be on top of that all the time with the things that you were dealing with, and whether it was chemicals or fire related, I mean, your knowledge of PPE is well above that other individual's pay grade, and here she was challenging you, and I just
and it's applied knowledge as well. Let's not forget, it's not
bravo. It was good. I don't know. Did she even continue that dialogue after you explained to her?
No, I'd actually blocked her in 2020 because I found I was getting furious every time I'd read one of her posts. So she probably doesn't even know that I replied to it. But the first thing that drew me in was talking to Adam about the applied side is that I was trained in, we called it NBCD in the day, it's CBRN now, Nuclear Biological Chemical Defense.
Right.
And because we were training as a NATO deployment unit, we had to meet the NATO standards for, it was called STOW in the day, survival to operate, which meant that you could continue to operate a fighter aircraft operation and be able to prosecute targets on an airfield that had been slimed, with either a chemical agent like sarin, nerve gas, or a biological agent, or a cloud of fallout. And when we do tactical evaluations in NATO, we'd actually assess people on their ability to do this. So we do a 5-day, it would start with DEFCON 5, and then by day 2, you'd be at DEFCON 2 and DEFCON 1 on Wednesday, which was limited nuclear exchange, and everybody would be in masks and poopy suits, NBCD charcoal suits with.
Please tell me you all called that DEFCON 1 Wednesday in the mess hall. Sorry.
So when I started seeing, medical people posting that there's no proof that respirators work, I'm like, what planet are you from? Like I
know.
And part of it was, my annual certification involved me putting on one of those chemical isolation suits and a full face butyl rubber respirator and going into a chamber full of tear gas and practicing my decontamination drills. So actually taking the hood off and the mask off and holding my breath and using in the early days, it was diatomous earth.
Yep.
In a cloth baggie you'd put over your hand, and then you'd have to pat and rub to get the chemical agents off. And then Canada developed this stuff called RSDL, reactive skin decontamination lotion. It's used all over the world now. It's like olive oil on a sponge that deactivates every known chemical and biological agent as well, it turns out. But so you'd wipe yourself down with olive oil and then put your mask on and do your clearance drills. And if you failed in any of them, you'd end up with a snoot full of tear gas, which leaves a lasting memory. So that applied aspect, like when people started saying respirators didn't work, I'm like, I've trusted my life to respirators multiple times with no concern whatsoever about it, because that's the way you survived. And, and the procedures we used had actually been verified by the military in live agent trials. Like it wasn't, I don't think they do that anymore, but there were days where you would regularly expose troops to mustard gas, for example, just to help them develop confidence in their equipment. So stuff that's survived the test of time.
The Edifice Complex will continue in just a moment.
Are you struggling with paperwork, spreadsheet overload, and project management? Then Blue Rhythm is the solution to help you. Streamline your commissioning and project management process. Go paperless. Increase efficiency, and save money. Blue Rhythm is commissioning and project management software by practitioners for practitioners, adapting to your workflows and processes, and doing things your way. Blue Rhythm provides painless and fast onboarding by bringing your existing workflows, forms, checklists, and issues logs into Blue Rhythm for you. You can use their pre-built templates to customize your commissioning workflows, and Blue Rhythm can fully handle the transition from your current software platform. Blue Rhythm is secure, scalable, and reliable, backed by amazing support, and accessible 24/7 on any Windows, iOS, or Android device. Why are you still using paper and hard-to-control spreadsheets? Start your free Blue Rhythm account today at bluerhythm.com.
And now, back to the show.
Yeah, so what we're talking about here, so this is one of my criticisms of pure academics. They're pure academics. My question to them is, where's your applied experience, your applied knowledge, right? You're talking about applied knowledge and takeaways from a high consequence example, right? There's nothing more high consequence than DEFCON 1, 2, 3, 4, right? You know what I mean? So it's not nothing. And this is where this whole there was a lot of righteous academics I found, right? I'm blah, 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 PhD, therefore I am right, was basically the presupposition for everything they typed and wrote, I thought. Did you see it that way? Did you experience that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, for sure. And it's, that's always the first red flag, right? When somebody makes an overt claim of authority.
Yes.
And contrasted very nicely by some academics who were extremely gracious and welcoming, again, no names, but I ended up being involved with the drafting of that article in the British Medical Journal with academics from University of Toronto and from Oxford, who I never would have encountered in my life if it wasn't for being a loudmouth on Twitter about air advocacy. But people who said, and I had a conversation with the chap from the U of T who said, I said, thank you very much. I'm actually just a dumb engineer. Like, you guys are all much more in on the technical side of this than I am. And he said, no, you have a really important perspective to bring that we don't have. Yes. And which is interdisciplinary work, right? Which is also a cornerstone of engineering, which is something else that's been a huge failure in the pandemic.
Yeah. So that interdisciplinary work, again, that's something you highlighted, Robert, right? During the course of this, the lack of I can't speak today.
Well, the opposite
overlap, right? Sorry, mate, go on.
Yeah, I mean, the opposite of integration is segregation, and segregation has had in these circumstances where it's life and death. It's important to have people with interdisciplinary knowledge and skills come together, and it's not like this is that we needed a Navy SEAL team, but we did. In terms of dealing with this. And we had individuals who were very much self-proclaimed, worked within a world of segregation, didn't understand what integration meant. And ultimately, as a society, and I posted this many, many times, that in a life and death situation, those in charge of minimum controls, should they be in fact in charge? And being in charge of minimum requirements and minimum standards works when there's not a life and death situation. But in a life and death situation, the people in charge of minimums, they are the wrong people. We have the wrong people in charge in the pandemic. We need it highly. Yeah.
I was going to say, it was really clear in, I think at Royal Melbourne Hospital was in late 2020. So this was such a beautiful example of people who are grounded in reality and processing data. They noticed that their nursing staff who were unmasked at the nursing station were having a high degree of COVID infection. So the hospital people said, we got to figure out what's going on here because we don't understand where these nurses are getting infected from. So they're like, we need somebody who understands how air flows in buildings. So of course they called their neighborhood infection control department. No, they contacted the local engineering faculty and said, we think we've got airflow issues in our building. Can you come and work with us? So they brought the engineering faculty, came in with their theatrical smoke generators and all the other equipment that ventilation engineers use. And they discovered that because the HVAC system probably had never been balanced in recent history, that the design flow, which is nursing station into patient rooms and then exhaust, right, had reversed. And it was actually flowing from the patient rooms out into the hallway to the nursing station. And guess what? They got in their HVAC people, they rebalanced the system, they got it flowing the right way, and the transmission dropped off. Now that's, for me, was when I read that, I'm like, that is the epitome of interdisciplinary work. We don't know how this works. We need to call in the experts. Call in the experts, you work together as a team and you contribute, which is right. And it was the other reason why I started getting really frustrated in 2020, because for engineers, it's like, this is our default mode of working because it's almost never you are the only engineer on a project because our scope of expertise is so narrow now that like on a building project, right? You're going to be one of dozens of different disciplines working together, including architects and maybe agrologists if you're dealing with the land around it, and geotechnical people, maybe geoscientists as well. Like, you're always working on these teams where you don't understand everything. So everybody sitting around the table together, the collective community understands it.
I want to talk about lessons learned, but just to quickly talk about the politics, because for me, sort of from the outside looking in, I had made a conscious decision not to jump on Twitter and get involved because my head would freaking explode. But it was really amusing watching you, Robert. So thank you for that TV show for the last 2 years. But what you had was like academics, applied engineers, teachers, school boards, and politics all colliding, right? No one backing down. Everyone, I'm right. No, I'm right. And do you think it was just literally a political shit show? And if the politics hadn't been there, we would have had a different approach?
I'm not sure I would pin politics as the issue.
Right.
I think what has become really clear to me, at least, is that the cycles of dysfunction that are driving a lot of the stuff going on with the pandemic come back to fundamental issues about power and control.
Yeah.
Yes.
And some of that is certainly in political groups, but the epitome of this is the Ontario Nurses Union going to court to get the right to wear respirators in the workplace. Like what?
Yeah,
no,
it's in the occupational health and safety legislation,
yeah,
for gracious sake. So they go to court, and what do they get? But a whole litany of infectious disease doctors who sign declarations that COVID is entirely transmitted by droplets and respirators don't work, even though it's wrong with droplets, of course. But so one of the things that became apparent to me through talking through some really smart people, especially people who had been involved in the SARS-1 commission afterwards, was that the patterns of control and power, concern about power, were driving most of the discussions that were causing harm. Because I've done this a number of times in my career, and it's cost me big. The ejection seat story.
Yeah.
I burned basically every bridge I had with Air Division headquarters, because what ended up in the end, it became clear to me that all of the mid-level staff officers had not been telling the commander the truth about the ejection seat problem.
Cool.
So on the last day of our meeting, he basically said, if I had known this a year ago, I would have acted immediately. So that was a whole class of people that I would have worked with if I'd stayed in the military. My name was mud to them. But the issue is especially for professionals who know, and this is what motivated me to start beacon off on Twitter, was the fact that I have specific knowledge that is relevant to this situation. And I actually have a professional and a legal obligation to intervene in some of these conversations where I see people going off the rails factually, because my profession demands that I intervene. Now, that power and control dynamic, right? The reason it successfully exists is because there are not enough people who are willing to say, I'm going to intervene and place my career at risk to stop this process.
There's a cowardice issue, ultimately.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. And you see it, like if you look at Challenger, the great example is Alan McDonald, who was I remember his job title. He was the most senior engineer on the solid rocket booster side at Morton Thiokol. And he was the one that said, I refuse to sign the launch authorization for Challenger. So he and his team and the other engineers that were in that area, they all knew that there was a serious failure mode that they actually thought was going to blow up on the pad. And McDonald writes that when it made it 30 seconds in the air, he thought, oof, we dodged that bullet. Of course, it was like 56 seconds. It actually blew up. But so he refused to sign the launch authorization. That's courageous.
Yeah, that's
career-ending
courage, right? Yeah.
And his boss, who was the VP, after being told by one of the other senior guys, take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat, signed the launch authorization. And now I use that in every one of my ethics briefings, because there's a slide with that guy's name signed at the bottom of it saying he recommends the launch. Now, so the interesting part of that for me is, and then now they didn't stop there with Alan McDonald. So the Commission of Inquiry is being held, right? Which includes Richard Feynman. Like, it's a really high-powered panel. First public hearing day, Alan McDonald's in the audience. When they finish the day, he walks up to the front and says to the commission members, this is my name. This is where I work. I have information you need to hear. Because up until that point, Morton Thiokol had kind of been spinning the response and saying, oh, it was an unexpected failure. We had no anticipation, the usual sort of stuff you would hear from.
Yeah, running interference, basically, right?
Yeah, and Alan McDonald went up and said, that's all wrong. We knew exactly what was going to happen. And in fact, I refused to sign the launch authorization. And the commission went, whoa, we've heard none of this from the people speaking to us from Morton Thiokol. We need to talk to you. So they drew him in, changed the direction of the inquiry. And they specifically wrote in their report, there had better be no job action against him, or we will be coming for you. I'm paraphrasing, but
Yeah, in nicer legal speak, but basically that, right?
Because what they did with him is they shuffled him off into a job to say, you need to figure out how to manufacture the next generation of solid rocket boosters. And he says in his book at that point, he knew he was on his way out. And then after the commission report came out, they reappointed him into his old job, which he worked until the end of his career. And then he said, one day I was in the attic and found my big box of notes, right? Whistleblowers always keep notes, keep receipts. He had his big box of notes from Challenger. And he said, I need to write a book about it, and wrote this wonderful book, Truth Lies in O-Rings, which is an engineer's dream because it's
that
all
cool? Truth Lies. I'll go and check that out.
Truth Lies in O-Rings.
Yeah.
It's all the technical details about Challenger solid rocket boosters you never knew that you needed to know.
I'm going to put a link to that in the show notes. So wasn't it Richard Feynman who made the analysis that discovered the O-ring was the problem?
Yeah. And did his famous with a C-clamp and a glass of ice water on the table at the press conference.
He's my hero, that dude. He's great.
Yeah, and his great line, which I've tweeted more than once. What is it now? Mother Nature will not be fooled, but it's the beginning of it is something like perceptions must give way to reality because Mother Nature will not be fooled. I'll look it up.
Something like that. Yeah. He's got so many great quotes. That guy is like, if you crossed a comedian with a pickpocket and a housebreaker and an academic and a scientist, you get Richard Feynman, basically.
Yeah, it's a shame his whole life wasn't as laudatory, but yeah, he's an amazing guy for sure.
He must have been the best teacher ever. If you had him as your teacher, that's got to be the luckiest day of your life, I reckon.
For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled.
Yeah.
Doesn't that epitomize the pandemic? Like, isn't that it?
Yeah. God, what would he make of all the bullshit on the pandemic, eh? Wow.
I mean, all you had to do was look around. I mean, you just observe Mother Nature, and she's the teacher, there's a lot of, we have kids listening, students and kids. I mean, young adults that are in university or college right now, listening to the podcast, and some of you will be faced in your careers where you have to make some hard decisions. And Adam, we've talked about this before, my own experience, where I had 3 choices that were given to me by a representative of a large corporation that had acquired my business. One of them was to continue communicating with an individual that I found completely offensive, and I was done. I did not want to have another word with him. I didn't return his calls. I didn't return his registered letters, nothing. I just was done with him. He was so offensive. The other option I had was to change my principles in order for me to stay. And the other one was to quit. And I had to tell this individual that there is no way that I will ever communicate with this individual again. My principles are not negotiable, and I have never quit anything in my life. So I guess the ball's in your court. So I was fired for insubordination.
Now that to me sounds like they stood you to attention, ripped your epaulets off, broke your sword. Out you go, right? Insubordination. I love that.
Subsequent to that, we bought the business back 2 years later because they drove it into the ground.
Win.
and then right? So when when you get out of school and you start to practice and you find yourself in positions where you have to stand on your principles, those are things that are inherent. That's who you are. Those are your character traits. And they should never be negotiable, ever. And you'll be faced with that when it comes and I remember when we were working on a project where this was a professional engineer who instructed our team that in the event that we win the contract, that a certain percentage of that contract fee would to be mailed to him to his personal residence. And when that was brought to my attention, I said, pull it. We're done. We're not bidding on the project. So you'll be faced with those decisions. Those are real world things. And you have to be able to say, no, these are non-negotiable. Because once you do that, then you will be that forever. Everybody will know you. That's the kind of individual you are. And that's just not something you want on your resume.
So ethics, personal core values and personal ethics, you can't control the ethics and core values of people around you or the institutions you work for, but you have 100% control over your own personal.
Absolutely.
And that's what sorts the men from the boys, right? Can you make that sense? All great when everything's going great, everything's great, right? You go along, but when that time comes, like that guy at that launch, how big were his balls, right? To say, no, I am not signing off on that launch. Talk about high consequence. My goodness, doesn't get any bigger than that. Oof. So look, we're getting close, but I do want to, knowing what we know now, we've had this like 2-3 year COVID journey. We've seen every form of fuckery that there is to have, right? Excuse my French there. But, I'll put this to you, Matthew. What's the one or two things that you would do differently knowing what you know now? What would you have changed?
Yeah, I think I read an analysis I think it was a sociologist. This is a couple of years ago, so I can't remember who it was, but and they basically made the point that people will often grasp and remember in crises when they're challenged, people will grasp and remember the first thing they're told.
Yeah.
So if we could go back and change any one thing in the pandemic, back in those days of March 2020, it would have been to start the message about respiratory protection and specifically certified respirators right from the get-go. Because that's something that the national stockpile, it was all time expired, but the national stockpile had millions of respirators that still could have easily been used as an interim measure until manufacturing could have been spooled up. That would have been the lowest cost and least imposing mitigation that could have been brought in from day one. And it arguably, like globally, it would have saved tens of millions of lives if we had been able to do that. And then part two of that would have been to, as the information was being gathered by the specialists in those areas, would have been to start to look at doing both short-term and medium-term fixes to ventilation. Because I remain convinced that the key to, I guess as ASHRAE does, who are the actual experts, but the key to mitigating transmission of respiratory pathogens is to make sure the ventilation systems are up to snuff. I mean, it's not going to give you 100%, which is another interesting side discussion that came up recently about, there's a group of people that are sort of the zero tolerance for unmasking, but there were a few of us trying to make the point that in engineered systems, you never achieve zero risk. No. It's a question of balancing cost and limitations with the amount of risk that you're going to accept. And if we looked at our ventilation systems, we could achieve very low transmission, even if people weren't doing any other mitigations. And just as a footnote onto that, I'd be interested in hearing if you notice the same thing. But one of the things I've noticed as I walk around with my CO2 monitor is that the level of ventilation in like Class A office buildings or the higher priced conference centers is actually pretty impressive. I was at a conference in Banff a couple months ago and like 600 people in the conference facility, and I could see that the system was moderating based off of CO2 because I could see it would bump up to 700 and then it would drop.
Ventilation control, yeah, perfect.
Yeah, so like 700 ppm in a room full of 600 people is pretty freaking impressive.
Yeah, absolutely it is.
And I would guess if I had been there 10 years ago, I wouldn't, because we all know what those conference facilities were like, right? You'd sit there and by lunchtime, the room would be hot and sweaty and everybody would be falling asleep.
Yeah.
So I suspect a bunch of that's been done on the down low in the background. But it's only I haven't sampled like Class B and Class C office buildings, but it's only in the ones charging the highest degree of rent. It's the ones in the middle and the retail spaces that probably didn't have good ventilation to start with.
Well, 80% of people reside, but this goes to power and control, right? So we're all through it. Everyone's going, oh, phew. And I think, and I'm worried that it's going to fade into memory and we're just going to go back to doing what we've always done, right? So I'd love to see a real impetus on updating codes and for ventilation in buildings, particularly schools, right? More fresh air, more DOAS, things like that. Anything more than we're doing now would be okay. Better filtration standards. But I have a horrible feeling it's such a lot of work to get a change in building code or standard that it's just going to become difficult and it's going to fade away. What do you think about that, Robert? You're involved in codes.
Yeah, I mean, I've always said that, minimums become maximums.
Yeah.
In a free market system, minimums become maximums. So if you want a higher level of performance, then you have to change the minimum.
Correct. Yeah.
Because no one will step up, or not no one, but very few people will step up to maximum. And I've not seen that deviate in my entire career. People always will work with the minimums.
Yeah.
And it's one of the things I saw constantly when I was doing forensic work for law firms. One of the questions you'd often get asked is this a code compliant installation? And most of the time the answer is, yeah, it's code compliant. And then the lawyer would say, but then how did the fire start? Like, well, code doesn't guarantee safety. And they would be like, what? Like, yeah. Well, no, codes and standards don't guarantee safety. They're minimum design standards that are imposed because they're convenient and cost effective. But there's stuff in codes that will kill you if you don't know what you're doing, right? I mean, anybody that's done design work knows that.
Yeah, people have a complete misunderstanding of what codes are all about. And it is about reducing risk, not guaranteeing safety. And, and even in terms of environmental systems, which is sort of my shtick, there's nothing in the codes that say we have to build comfortable buildings. We have to build buildings so that people don't become sick in them. But being sick and being comfortable are not the same thing. And that applies to lighting, it applies to air, it applies to, all fire, all of this. It's amazing that people don't understand that. But
building code is part of the social contract, right? It's where governments say to people, I've got your back. There are these things we're doing to keep you safe. And codes came from public health, right, originally. And I don't think they've actually evolved that much from it, right?
Well, fire was the big, sort of the leading reasons for codes to prevent fires, but there's a relationship between government and those that write codes.
Yeah.
And so the mandates are oftentimes, they're dictated from government. Like the people that actually write them are getting their directions from the government. And so for us to change the minimum requirements requires political forces. Well, it requires a voice of the people is really what it comes. We've talked about this before, Adam, that, if you want to see change, people have to get involved.
Yeah. So government needs to get a signal from people in aggregate that they need to change.
In aggregate.
That down, right, to the code writers. So that would be like a civil disobedience on sending people to school would be the only way you probably get that, right?
Yeah, and the thing, and you said something, and that's in aggregate. Like, there has to be a sufficient mass of people with the same voice to cause change, because, we've seen Canadians for Properly Built Homes. I used to be involved with that, and I occasionally do. If Dr. Karen Somerville asks me for my opinion, I will obviously give it to her. But, she has worked for decades on behalf of Canadians that have ended up with lemons for no money. It's a purely volunteer organization, and she, has struggled. She's always there whenever there's an opportunity to change the laws and influence politicians. She's always there, but to get changes of consequence has been her life struggle.
Yeah,
because political forces will listen, but they won't act. And they won't act because there's not enough people willing to stand up. Again, it goes back to what you're saying, Matthew. People that don't say what they're obligated to say something. Well, as a member of society, if you have any ethics and morals and want to see a better world, it's not going to happen by not saying nothing. You have to say something. We have an opportunity to do that when we vote, but that's not sufficient enough. We've never seen,
it can only come from disobedience, because you can't have violence, because violence gets dealt with, right? It has to be disobedience. Gandhi was onto something, right? He defeated the most powerful empire in the world by civil disobedience. There's something going on there, right? If enough parents said, you know what? This isn't safe, I'm not sending my kids to school, that would be something that would move a needle, at least make a news show, which would, that's another part. But anyway, we're getting into big things here. But, I'm not advocating for civil disobedience. Don't cancel me, right? Too old to be cancelled.
There's another model too, which is Ralph Nader, right? If you can get somebody who's able to galvanize a social movement, looking at automobile safety. I don't know his story that well, but I think, didn't he have a family member who was killed in a
Yes, so he's
accident?
Lebanese American, and he's the reason there are seatbelts in cars. And they have never forgiven him. The Democratic Party, he's a political outcast in the US for his work on that. And then he ran for Democratic office afterwards, and the whole Democratic machine turned against him. He is like persona non grata. He's like the Democratic version of Ross Perot. So his thanks for making everybody safe and probably saving thousands of lives is political ostracization. So no good deed goes unpunished, I guess, right?
Well, we saw that one.
I don't know, should be a sir, should have a VC. I don't know what it is, but he needs something.
Yeah, ASHRAE faced the same thing when the cigarette lobbyists, the tobacco groups, fought hard against the changes that were going to happen. There's the fact that people aren't allowed to smoke in planes anymore, or in restaurants, or healthcare, or schools. That's because the engineers and the industrial hygienists and the medical community got together and said, this is wrong.
Yeah.
This has to stop. Well, anybody that had a voice, in particular ASHRAE, because they were one of the leading organizations, I mean, the lawsuits that ASHRAE had to face over that were huge.
No,
but again, you have to stand up for what's right, and the aggregate in terms of housing, for example, or building safety, that has to come from society in an aggregated way. And you're right, Adam. It's the Gandhi approach, or other, or as Matthew said, the Ralph Nader's, the quality control. That's also a way of doing it.
Ralph Nader is a great example for that. Actually, that's the world.
Yeah.
Matthew, we're coming up in the end. You might be the Dos Equis guy for engineers, the most interesting engineer in the world. I think you might have that. So that could be my name for you. But
I have a question for Matthew.
Yeah, we finished with one quick question each, right? So you go first, Robert. Go.
Yeah. So we had Professor Roland Clift on from Oxford University. He's a very interesting gentleman. And if you haven't heard the podcast, it's actually worth listening to him. We have actually had him on twice. We had him on with Bill Blomfliff, Shelley Miller, Hema Murdy, and Roland Clift. There was the four of them, and it was a great interview. Roland did a course on ethics and engineering, and one of his studies had to do what would have been like to be an engineer under the rule of Adolf Hitler. Mm. So my question is to you. You and Roland end up on a university somewhere in the world, and Roland says, I'm retiring. I can no longer do my ethics course, and so I want you to do it, Matthew, and I want you to talk about being an engineer under Adolf Hitler. What's your message to the students?
Oh,
no pressure.
Buy lots of starch for your shirts. Nobody had creases like the Nazis.
They were the best dressed villains in the world, right?
Wow. It actually wouldn't be much different than what I say now, which is, that puts a different spin on it, because notable character for me, one of the people I'd say is sort of a heroic role model that I've looked to more than once is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So Bonhoeffer was a Lutheran pastor and a university professor in Germany, started the Second World War. He started the underground Lutheran seminary to train pastors after the Lutheran Church backed the Nazis. So that power and control rate, the Lutheran Church leadership said, hey, we better get on board with these guys or we're all going to be dead. So they supported it. So now you've got religious endorsement of genocide, which happens all the time, of course. It's not like that's unusual. And then Bonhoeffer wrote a lot about community and leadership and morals. And he was actually one of the participants in one of the plots to assassinate Hitler. which is fascinating. So as an avowed pacifist, right, a person who believes in nonviolence, he said he reached a point where he realized he had no other option, but he had to go down this road, even though he considered it, I don't know if he uses the word evil, but he considered it to be an evil act. But he said, I have no other choice at this point. He ends up imprisoned, and the SS execute him like on the last day before the war ends. And he's left this body of work about what it means to be in community and what it means to be an ethical leader. And I mean, that's what I would say, is that you, like, the reason Adolf Eichmann was so successful in implementing the final solution, right, was because he had cores of very, very skilled engineers who were designing those logistics systems and to be crass, the processing systems in order to murder a whole bunch of people and dispose of the bodies. Like, that's our profession there as well. And unfortunately, engineering has been complicit in lots of stuff, right? When I talk about reconciliation in engineering, one of the realities in colonial societies is that engineering has always been the engine of colonialism. The railway wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the railway engineers that were supporting the work to push the railway across Canada, which went along with forced starvation and disease and everything else that happened to the First Nations. So that would be my comment to an engineer working for the Nazis, is that you need to be prepared to step aside and set up an underground engineering group that's going to do the contrary resistance work, that's going to try and bring some balance back, accepting that you might end up being executed or killed out of it. But I think and I say that realizing that I know that this is not something that 100% of the population is ever going to do. It's probably, the people that are willing to take courageous stance that risk their life are probably 99th percentilers, maybe 20%, maybe 5%, but it's the group of people, that are willing to end up on the cover of Time as the Enron whistleblower, for example. And almost always they have unhappy lives afterwards, because whistleblowers rarely end up getting the OBE, and
whistleblowers always get the bullet in the head eventually.
Yeah. So, but you talked earlier, Robert, about establishing that framework of principles and being unwilling to compromise on it. For me, what I always say when I talk about ethics is you need to understand where your line in the sand is, and then you need to refuse to cross it. And the reason I do that isn't because my professional ethics requires it. It's because I need to get up every morning and look at myself in the mirror and say, I've done the absolute best I can to make the world a better place in the last 24 hours. And if I can't say that to myself, it means I need to go back and fix the damage that I've done. So yeah, it's people like Bonhoeffer. You need those courageous individuals who are going to start the contrary movements to resist. And we see it we've seen it in the pandemic as well, right? There's large cohorts of engineers that are completely complicit. That's why a lot of the work around the school boards has been so challenging, because there are engineers who say things like, I think ASHRAE is just there to promote income for the filter industry.
Someone should tell ASHRAE that. That'd be the one time you'll see ASHRAE.
There was many comments that were like that. We got a podcast on that for Amanda Ho.
ASHRAE approved to school design. But you know what? Yeah. Matthew, you're absolutely right there. Ethics is so important and so little thought about, right? Because you have to know who you are, and you only know who you are when you're faced with that big decision. You think you're all that, but when you're faced with that decision, can I kill someone? Can I do this? Can I do that? It's like the soldier, right? You go and you're a soldier, but at some point you might be faced with that decision, right? And that's when you know. You never know till that comes. Ethics is the same, right? Bonhoeffer, put it all on the line. A man of God, right? Boom, go on.
Yeah. Yeah. And the way I've been talking about ethics in the last few years is because I am fascinated with complex system failures, because it comes out of investigating aircraft accidents and complex accidents. The way complex systems tend to degrade and slide into failure modes that are unexpected and surprising. You can't predict the failure mode of a complex system because it's complex. That's one of the defining characteristics of it.
Chaos theory based, ultimately, right?
Yeah. One of the things I realized, I have a friend who works in oil and gas here in Alberta, asked me if I'd do a big, like a 7-hour sort of ethics module for his engineers, and he challenged me to put it together, and I started to put it together, and I'd been reading a bunch of complex systems theory at the time, and it clicked for me that ethical system failures fail the same way as complex technical systems, which is why you need to build resilience into the system in advance of the failure mode occurring, because you can't anticipate the failure mode. So you build resilience in, so when the failure happens, the system can handle it gracefully. It's the exact same thing with us and ethics. You know, you need to build that ethical resilience in. And part of that resilience is exactly what you both been talking about. It's I'm going to reinforce where my line in the sand is, where my principles stop, because if I don't reinforce it, that line is going to shift. It's the same as a complex system operating point, that normalization of deviance that Diane Vaughan talked about with Challenger. You know, as you shift your operating point, the acceptable behavior boundary shifts as well on the ethics side. And before you know it, you're taking kickbacks at your home address, because that's what everybody's doing.
Yeah, and it creeps. It's a creep, right? It's not a big thing. It's a creep. You just creep along, and before you know it, you're not the person you thought you are.
Which is why you need to sort it out in advance, because like a complex technical system, you don't realize you're in a failure mode until you're already in failure mode, and you're like, oh my God, why am I getting kickback checks at my home address? Like, how did that happen?
You got to enunciate. You got to state it, right? And you got to examine that. God, that's great. I love this subject. So I'm going to ask you a slightly lighter question.
But you might want to move on to Mussolini or Pol Pot or somebody else for the next.
So my question is, pretend that there's an 18-year-old boy or girl, they're just graduating high school and they're contemplating a career. What would your advice be to them?
Yeah. I won't say this is Newton nor two cats came to visit. I won't say the one that's all the posters, follow your dreams, because I'm not sure.
No, that is utter BS, by the way. Whoever tells you that is a liar.
That's not a path to happiness. No. I think, like, when I talk to high school students who are interested in engineering, usually what I try to encourage them to do is look at what.
Is that your cat?
I can't decide trying to hypnotize you.
Yeah, this is Newton. It comes to visit me on my desk. I have a bookshelf next to me that has a bed in it for him, so he hops up here and sits on my keyboard and destroys my work, and then crawls into his bookshelf.
Cats are gangsters. They don't care about anything.
Sorry, I just didn't want to stop your train of thought there. Good question, though, Adam. Carry on.
Yeah, so to figure out what it is that they find interesting and engaging, because I think I remember reading, it was like over a decade ago, there was this theory in self-help going around that you're supposed to hate your job because the only reason you work is to get money so you can do fun stuff. So you need to stop talking about finding a job you love and just find one you can tolerate to make enough money to survive. I thought, wow.
A bit nihilistic.
Yeah, because it's not like I've always loved my job, but I've always enjoyed what I'm doing, because there's lots of challenges and lots of things to dig into and lots of ethical stuff to get into. So when people are interested in engineering, I try to say to them, well, what actually do you like about the world? Like, what do you like doing? And then to talk to them about what it is that they do, to see if they can find the links there. I'm also a big fan of, we had a long chat with my daughter about going into trades, into apprenticeship, because, I've considered becoming an electrician more than once in my life, because I love wiring. I really enjoy putting barrettes on things. Yeah. So to find something that's going to keep you engaged, and really, if it was a vocational question, I would take it back to asking, like, where is it that you think you're most called to make a difference in the world? Because that's, this theory of community, like we've seen with the air advocacy community, which has been it's the only thing that's kept me going for the last 3 years, has been this community of like-minded people, some of whom I don't get along with that well, because they can be abrasive and have opinions I don't like. But we've come together because we're focused on this idea that we have an obligation to make life better for more people than just our small group, to talk to people about where is it you're going to find that. And I'm not a huge fan of university education necessarily anymore, because I think it's certainly got a place.
Right. I'm all in on that.
Yeah, it certainly has a place because we need, especially in the professions, but the adage that we've had for a while in first world cultures about you need to get a university degree if you're nothing. If you want to go and study like English literature for 4 years, because that's really gets you going. I know when I've been hiring people, I'm less concerned about where they went to school and what they studied, and more concerned about who they are as a person and how well they can think through things.
Yep.
Like this is funny, the forensic firm I worked for, it was called Sintra. They were just bought out last year by CEP. I think they're an international firm. The head of their property group who I worked for, I was in his office talking to him one day, and he had this big box of junk, it looked like, on the corner of his desk. And I said, "What's this?" Because there was an old bellows camera folded up on top of it. And I picked it up and I unfolded it because I love bellows cameras. And he said, "Oh, okay. So you know how practical forensics work is, right?" He said, "We would hire these investigators right out of school who would have no idea about how to investigate a fire scene because they don't have any practical knowledge to apply their technical knowledge." He said, "So when I do interviews of engineers now, I've got this box of really complicated gadgets and I give them one and say, I'm going to give you 10 minutes, figure out how it works, figure out how to take it apart. And when I come back, you need to explain it to me." So he'd give them this old bellows camera and walk out of the office and come back in 10 minutes. And he'd say some of them would be still sitting there with it and saying, I don't even know how to open it. And then others would be like, "Oh yeah, it's an old bellows camera. Look, and this is how you open up. This is where the film goes. This is the lens." And guess which group he would hire?
Yeah, that's hilarious. I love that.
Yeah, and then he said, "And I'm not going to hire any more engineers that didn't grow up on farms because we can't find engineers that understand how to use common hand tools like saws and hammers and screwdrivers." And I'm like, "What?"
We've had that conversation so many times, Matthew, Adam and I, right?
Hilarious.
That's great. Yeah,
I love that.
And I took it for granted when I was doing my military training because I spent my summers on the flight line working as a shadow to technicians, right? So we would do OJT, we'd go to a flying unit, they'd put coveralls on us, they'd give us a speeder and put us out on the flight line doing grunt work and learning how to use hand tools with people who were experts in it. I mean, I remember an oil change on a Dakota where one of them dropped the wrench into the oil sump, which is like this deep of noxious oil out of the radial engine. And they both looked at me and laughed and said, "Aren't you going to get the wrench, trainee?" So, into the pit to get the oil. But that I didn't realize what a gift that was, those summers of just putting gas in airplanes and working with hand tools.
Yeah, that matters. That's good. So look, we've gone long, but I'm no with that. This has been a great interview. So listen, man, thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed that conversation because it's not often you get that zoom out on the big picture, the interdisciplinary thing, the ethics, the core values, how it links in with previous people like Rafe Noda. People need to make these connections because people don't. You get stuck in on your desk, right? So yeah, this has been fantastic, man. Really enjoyed it. And you are the most interesting engineer in the world. I'm going with that.
We'll get you a trophy.
a crest for my jacket.
That's it.
Yeah, awesome.
Thank you so much to both of you.
Up to your LinkedIn profile picture, by the way.
Yeah.
Awesome, man. So thank you so much. Brilliant. Really great interview. Thanks a lot.
The Edifice Complex will continue in just a moment.
Are you passionate about the built environment? Do you want to learn from the industry's most inspiring, intelligent, and accomplished professionals? Then the companion to this podcast, Wisdom of the Property Crowd, is just the book for you. From Edifice Complex podcast interviews, this book distills the critical thinking, insight, and ideas of some of the property industry's most accomplished and respected practitioners. Each chapter is a synopsis of an hour-plus interview, capturing the takeaways and insights, including diagrams and images to help explain concepts and ideas. There's also a brief bio about the interviewee and a QR code linked to the podcast episode for those that want to explore further. These are the mentors you wish you had in college. Wisdom of the Property Crowd by Adam Muggleton. Available on Amazon worldwide.
And now, back to the show.
Probably one of the most interesting individuals we've had on the podcast.
Yeah.
I mean, they're all, I'm going to say this before, they're all interesting. We've had some great guests on. What Matthew brings to the table, I mean, he's a deep thinker, right? And I mean, if you read his resume, and that tells a story. You look at his occupations over the years, and that tells a story. But if you're really good at reading between the lines in someone's resume and their occupation, you begin to see the complexity of and his level of knowledge.
Yeah,
is incredible. I mean, you don't get into forensics unless you know something about how things break or how you design things.
Yeah,
you know,
it's interesting hearing him talk about failure analysis because one of the courses I took in my degree was systems analysis. So we did soft systems failure, hard systems, and that's exactly what he was talking about. Like complex systems, and then chaos theory comes up and just breaks them. That's a level of thinking that is beyond a traditional engineering degree.
Yeah.
When I was doing my degree and I did systems, I thought this would be interesting. I did it because I thought it'd be an easy pass. Turns out no. But it was also great because I was thinking, how is this applicable to me? But then you think like engineering systems are engineered, like certainly in built environment, like cooling system, heating system. That's it. These systems are complex. There's single points of failure. There's vulnerability. There's resilience issues. There's failure in them, right? So there's failure analysis. Yeah. I actually, when I think about it, use that framework a lot when I'm looking at drawings of that, right? Where's the failure here? Where's the problem? That's what you're looking for, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But
he talked about science and science not being settled and how some people the science is settled, right? And so they move on, but I
get so triggered when I hear that.
Yeah, it's not settled. And that's what science is about. It never gets settled.
If science is settled, humanity is over, pretty much.
Yeah.
Do you know what was great when he was talking about Bonhoeffer, the guy they executed just before the war? You know why they got rid of him, right? He knew too much. Yeah. But that whole talk about like, who are you? What is your line? I'd strongly advise everyone, no matter how young you are, work that out. What are your 2 or 3 core values? What do you stand for? Where's your line? And then revisit that frequently.
Yeah, that's good advice, Adam. I mean, the sooner you discover what that is, that is a fundamental building block of your personal characteristics.
Yeah.
Those are the blocks that you will never remove unless somebody puts a bomb on you. Like, those are the things that they're non-negotiable. This is who I am. This is what I stand on. And I am willing to, in the military, live and die on it. Or people that have those strong beliefs that are willing to die for it, Engineers are the same way. You're going to get faced with challenges. There are going to be ethical challenges. There'll be political challenges. There'll be legal challenges. You're going to face them. And your advice, Adam, about discovering what's negotiable and what isn't early on, that's good.
Actually just made the connection, I think, on why he came across so well and why he's been so successful is, so I work in the built environment. If I F up, someone gets cold, someone gets hot, no one dies. It's a low consequence environment, right? Really. Worst thing that happens to me is I get sued, right? I lose money. Whereas in the environment he comes from, military, like failure analysis, like sorting out ejection seats, injects, all that easy stuff, right? That's a high consequence environment. Yeah. So the level of rigor and discipline that you have to bring, you can't be, you can't be joking about it like we do. Do you know what I mean? Someone got cold. It's like for him it would be someone jumped out of a plane and died. Oops. It's a different mindset, right?
Well, what bears on one's conscience as a result of the failure is completely different. Someone loses a life because of your actions or inactions.
How'd you get over
a little bit different? Well, that's the thing. Some people don't.
Yeah.
That's the tough. He made us some statements about building resilience before failure. And I thought that was also really good words of advice that, and it kind of aligns with what you were saying, like understand who you are as a person, what's negotiable, what's not negotiable. And so that when you're faced with those decisions, you've built in the decision-making process ahead of time so that there isn't a failure. And he was, again, observing that in these complex systems is that failure doesn't happen because, in this grand, event. It's little events failing almost where they're imperceptible. There's unconscious things that go on, and then they start to accumulate and the snowball builds, and then all of a sudden you have massive failure. And that could be anything from, materials. Someone bought the wrong materials, right?
But it'd be all right because, it's just a small part in a big thing, Yeah,
and it's that complacency with the minute that on the surface might seem like it has no consequence, but when that happens enough, or that one decision, the failure of that one decision works its way through the complex system, that all of a sudden you have massive failure.
Yeah.
That was really good. Like build in
also going on with I've got this theory about how did Nazi Germany happen? How were so many people complicit in killing so many, genocide, right, of 6 million Jews, right? So the answer is bureaucracy. This is the evil of bureaucracy, right? So no one thought they were a bad person, right? And the genius of German bureaucracy was this: they broke everything down into a million little steps. So people could say, I'm not killing anyone. I've just checked the ticket for the person getting on the train. I'm a good person.
Yeah.
I'm not a bad person. I drive trains. I don't know what's in my freaking train. Right? This is the evil and banality of huge bureaucracy.
Yeah.
It can get normal, weak people to do horrendous stuff. That's why I'm always very leery of big bureaucracies and big state things, because take the pandemic, right? Everybody you interacted with and you all getting upset about with, and I was getting upset about, all thought they were doing the best thing possible. Yeah. No one thought they were a bad person, right? Based on what? I don't know. But, this is why you've got to know who you are. You've got to check yourself, look for them little slips, and be aware that it's like the old joke, right? Before D-Day, the French resistance was this big. After D-Day, everyone was into French resistance, right?
Yeah. Well, the problem with a lot of that too is that these individuals become detached from the consequence, and they are very good at rationalizing their actions. And a good example is that when they could say, well, you know what, this isn't a problem. Only 3% of the people died. Well, for the person that died, it was 100%.
Yeah.
Right. And so they become detached from the consequence. The statistics for them are inconsequential, except for the person that died. Obviously, it was a huge consequence. And you can't bring that person back because of the other person's, detachment from their actions. And
because that's like the bureaucracy thing, right? You're being disconnected from the ultimate consequence. You don't feel you're a bad person.
Yeah.
Right? And you're not thinking, you're trying not to think past your part in it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Heavy stuff, right? I feel like I need a drink.
It is heavy stuff. He said something, and I got to tell you, if I was still hiring people for engineering, that's brilliant. You put out a box of electromechanical devices on a table and give something to the young engineer that just gets out of school and say, okay, you take this thing apart, figure out how it works, put it back together again. I'm going to come back in 10, 15 minutes and we're going to chat about it. And then he comes back, and some people have taken it apart. They know it inside and out. Other people, it's like, I don't know what to do with it. And he's right. I mean, and he also made a comment, sort of like a footnote in terms of he would never hire an engineer that didn't have any farming background. He is right on that. Yeah. When you're a kid on the farm, by the time you're 16 or 17, you know how to do an oil change on a combine. You know how to fix belts and pulleys and springs. Yeah. You know how to take things apart, put them back together, and you understand consequences. You understand efficiency. You understand processes, production. Like there's just nothing by the time that you're 16 that you've already got a good start on the world of engineering. You may be a farmer, but you're got the brain of it.
You're hands-on, right? So that's the applied hands-on.
Yep.
This is the other thing about engineering, which I don't think is discussed much in university is, yes, you need the theory, 100%. But you also need to understand the application of it, right?
Yeah.
And that's those things, you need both, right?
Yeah.
You've got to add both. And I guess that's what licensing boards look for, right? That academic and then the experience, then you get your license. I guess that's what it's about. But, it's really, I don't think the applied stuff gets the value and attention that it needs by society, right? It's not valued overtly the way, say, a 4-year degree is.
Yeah.
I don't know. We're getting very philosophical in our old age.
We've had, again, going back to if you're a first-time listener to the podcast, Adam started this a long time ago to create mentorship. We have so many people that are in school, engineering colleges, and there's really nobody out there to look up to as a hero where there is in other professions, right? And that's one of the reasons why I jumped on board is because I think it's an admirable thing. And I think Adam, over the last 5 years, now going on, I think our 6th year coming up, there are so many good episodes, so many of our wrap-ups with such, that the wisdom. This episode with Matthew, ranks up there with the top.
This has been deep. I've been quite affected by speaking to him, actually.
Yeah, there's, so again, if you're a first-time listener, there's lots more like this conversation. If you're a parent of a student in a STEM program, all of the episodes, there are people who are sharing their wisdom that otherwise you would never get. And I would encourage you to listen to them and tell your friends and tell your family and your other students, because I got to tell you, if I was in school going back and this was available, I would be listening to those episodes.
Yeah.
Hey, by the way, before we wind up, you got a couple of books out. We keep forgetting to talk about it. I know we're going to put them in.
Hey, I should do a pluggable advert for my books, I guess, on my podcast.
You should. Absolutely, you should. I mean, it's like you climb the mountain, plant your flag, and I've got both copies. Thank you very much for that. And like I said, the one, and I'm not a practicing engineer anymore, but I keep that one. And when I go to do projects here with our stuff that we're here actually today doing stuff, for notes, right? Taking notes. And the other one, which was, just a collective, and I don't know how you did that. That would have been really hard. So what Adam did, for those who are listening, he's got a book there. He selected a number of our previous guests and just sort of took the highlights of what was talked about and the takeaways. And I don't know how you picked those, because we had so many good guests.
It was hard. It was hard to get it down to 10 because my editor said, I just need this number, no more. And I had to it's like killing they say, call it killing your babies, right? So you have to go, I'm going to pick. Sophie's choice, right? Someone's going to stay, someone's going to go.
It was. So that's going to be volume number 1. You got to do a volume 2, 3, 4, whatever.
Yeah, I will actually. This episode would be a candidate 100% to go in a book. And people need to know more, hear more from Matthew, 100%. Yeah. Anyway, so there's more to come. So you're right. I'll definitely get on that. I get some pluggables for my pluggables.
Yeah, there you go. All right, Adam. Man. Always a pleasure.
See you in the next one. Take care.
You've been listening to the Edifice Complex podcast with Adam Muggleton and Robert Bean. To access show notes for this episode, visit edificecomplexpodcast.com. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review on iTunes. See you next time.